a philosophy of sharing and of being open science, sharing data. Of course, it's not always open and people don't always sharing. The more you share and the more open you are, the faster science can go. Anyway, science should be without frontiers. For me, that's absolutely key. So we should make the most of all the riches that we have.
Are you working in research, trying to do the best science you can?
Are you a team leader, a research assistant, postdoc, PhD student, or any other type of scientist?
Are you looking for a place where you can sit, relax, and listen to inspiring people?
Well, we have good news for you. You've just found what you're looking for.
Hi everybody, my name is Renaud Pourpre.
And I am Jonathan Weitzman.
Welcome to the Lonely Pipette,
helping scientists
do better science.
So my name is Edith Heard, and I work on X chromosome inactivation at the EMBL in Heidelberg. And I'm really happy to share my tips with the Lonely Pipette.
So Edith Heard was born in London, UK. She read natural sciences at the University of Cambridge, followed by a PhD in Mike Fried's lab at the Imperial Cancer Research Fund. She then moved to the Pasteur Institute in Paris for a postdoc with Philippe Avner. During her postdoc, she began studying X chromosome inactivation and became fascinated by epigenetics. In 2001, she created her own team at the Curie Institute in Paris, where she subsequently became director of the Genetics and Developmental Biology Department. In 2012, she was appointed to the first chair of epigenetics and cell memory at the Collège de France in Paris. And in 2019, she became the first woman Director General of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, the EMBL, in Heidelberg. Edith has been awarded numerous awards for her work in epigenetics, including the Prix Jean Homburger, the Grand Prix de la Fondation de Recherche Médicale, the Silver Medal from the CNRS, the L'Oréal UNESCO Women in Science Award. She's a fellow of the Royal Society and a member of the US National Academy of Sciences, amongst many other things. Edith, thanks for coming to share your tips with the Lonely Pipette.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Thanks, Edith. It's a pleasure and a great honor to have you here for the season 2 of the Lonely Pipette. We need to say that we wanted you for the first season. Firstly, we love to ask our guests the origin story. So, could you tell us how you decided to become a scientist?
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I've been asked many times, and I usually say, well, at school, I was good at maths and physics and chemistry, and my dad was an engineer. So I ended up almost by default becoming a scientist. But I thought about it really hard for you.
Thank you.
And, I guess, and also with age, you start to think back to where you came from and where you might be going back to. And I realized that actually I had a very strange childhood. I was brought up not just in a multilingual setting. My mother was Greek, my father was English, and I was raised in London. So a very strange mixture of cultures. But actually, my scientific background, I think, goes right back to my daily life when I was a little girl. So my father was an engineer and an electrical engineer, but he was also fascinated by locomotives. So he had this huge garage where he would build locomotives. He also built an electronic organ, in the living room. And so I spent, from the moment I could sort of crawl around, I was crawling around little locomotives and organs. And my mother had been a nurse before she stopped working. And she was a very generous, kind person who would host people from Greece, both relatives and friends of friends. And these people who came, they all had one thing in common. Either they were exiles, political exiles, or they were sick. And in fact, the constant throughout my early life was that I was surrounded by people who were sick and came to London to be treated. And many of them came not just as single people, but whole families who were sick. So I was exposed to, for example, the genetics of breast cancer firsthand, because we would have a young woman, her mother and her aunt all coming to be treated at home, in London, staying at home with us. And so I guess this gave me a very early sense of mortality. I'm not afraid of thinking and talking about death because I was exposed to it so often when I was little, but also a realization that one wants to understand what's going on, what's happening. And so I was raised on the one hand with, real life human genetics, if you like. And then on the other hand, with an electrical engineer who built locomotives. And so when I would get too tired of my sort of mother environment, I'd go down to the garage and I'd sit there for hours watching my father build locomotives. So I guess I couldn't really be anything else but a scientist. And I only realized this quite recently. And I was an only child. So I spent this time with my parents exposed to these different aspects of science. So I think that's where my curiosity came from on the one hand. And perhaps also I went from, wanting to do physics because that's all I did actually, maths and physics and chemistry at school, to discovering biology when I was at university, where I was lucky enough because I was at Cambridge to be exposed to natural sciences. And so I could do biology. So there you go. That's how I became a scientist.
There is something that struck me on your story is that, you have the medical environment with your mom.
Yes, I had both the physics and the mechanics as well as the more medical. And then it took me a few years to work out what I exactly wanted to do.
But for the physics part, what I can see is you have all these tiny pieces to obtain a complete machine. So this is also what you're doing a bit in biology. You're deciphering all those little parts of what makes us, what makes functioning a cell. So
yeah, exactly. Knowing how something is put together and understanding, literally the mechanics of it somehow, and whether it's a chromosome or an embryo, it's true. I guess I've always been interested in actually understanding how things work and not really giving up easily when it comes to that understanding. The only thing that would really stop me was when there was truly a technical limitation. But otherwise, I was one of these slightly obsessive children who always wanted to get to the very bottom of things, like why does maths exist? Or, what is happening to the rest of the universe? And I would drive my father crazy because he was more of a sort of very down-to-earth, hands-on engineer. So I was interested in science, I guess, from the beginning, although it didn't feel like it was a vocation until quite late, until I went to university, where there I had my eureka moment and I realized that, yes, I was made to be a scientist and I didn't really have any choice.
So a tough question now. If you had not become a biologist, what would you have become?
So if I hadn't become a biologist, I probably would have become a physicist by default because I had applied to university to read physics. So Cambridge, I could do natural sciences, but then my next choice was Imperial College, and there I would have just done pure physics. If I hadn't decided to become a scientist when I was about, 10 or 11, I had to make the conscious choice of whether or not I was going to do music. So I did piano from a very early age, and then I started to learn to play the clarinet. And in fact, my father really encouraged me to become a musician. But I think I realized that much as I loved it, I just wasn't quite good enough. So I did actually make a conscious choice not to be a musician. Probably that was my first conscious choice. But then after that, science and biology, it was a much more gradual thing. But the final decision, I think, came when I did my third year at Cambridge, where I did genetics. And the genetics department of Cambridge was really quite a place to be. It was pretty wild, some very interesting characters, very inspiring. And that kind of made me, switch into the mode of wanting to be a research scientist and being quite motivated to sort of dedicate myself to that. But, I went through my ups and downs, as everyone does, I think. It wasn't a long, straight path that I followed at all. It was.
Were there any points when you thought you might leave science?
Oh, yes, several, even up until recently. I think, it's normal that scientists should doubt themselves. Whether they should doubt their mission in life, maybe that is very personal. But I often ask myself, why am I doing this? Am I the best person to be doing this? I'm quite tough on myself. I always have been. I guess that's also part of being an only child. I'm quite self-critical. So from the moment I started my PhD, I was wondering whether I'd made the right choice. And I would then convince myself of it being the right choice. But, in the middle of my PhD where nothing had worked and I'd been given at least 3 different projects to start, none of them were getting anywhere. In fact, my PhD supervisor, who was Mike Fried, an amazing guy, he'd come to me and say, Edith, you're getting nowhere fast. So, I did have my moments of doubt, and I applied actually to Nature. Nature offices were just down the road from the ICRF, and I applied for a job there and was rapidly turned off the idea of ever becoming an editor in a journal. So that was good. I did eliminate a few alternative paths along the way, and I hung on in there, and I am quite a robust person when it comes to, trying again and trying harder. So my PhD was really tough. But in the end, I made some discoveries that I'm proud of. I published a paper that didn't sort of rewrite, the science of the topic I was on. But I feel that I made a long, tough journey to achieving something that made me into a robust scientist that could go on and do a postdoc. After I started my postdoc, again, I had moments of doubt. Maybe I shouldn't have become a research scientist. Maybe I should have become a doctor or a medic or something. But, these thoughts became fewer and fewer. The moments of doubt, were more rare, and they became sort of more abstract. And then I really got hooked into the subject I've been working on for decades now, X inactivation. And once I got hooked on that, I don't think I really doubted the path I took.
So you mentioned Mike Fried. Can you think of mentoring practices that you learned from your mentors and then applied when you set up your own lab?
Oh, goodness. Mike was quite a mentor. Well, for one thing, within a few weeks of my arrival, he actually sat me down and said to me, Edith, you have to realize you need mentors. And that's the first time anyone had said this to me. And he really explained what that meant. It wasn't just about him, my supervisor. It was about people who would accompany you, not necessarily, informal sit-down sessions to tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing, but just people that you could talk to and who would watch out for you. And that's something I learned very early on from Mike Fried. He would always watch out for his people. I left his lab, and up until he died just a couple of years ago, every year he would send me a message at Christmas. He was from a good Jew from the Bronx, so there was no reason for him to send me a message at Christmas. But he would always do that and just ask how I was and how the family was, and say that he, noticed what I'd published. And so for me, that is very much the way I would like to be as a mentor as well. I'm not sure I'm quite as good as he was at it, but watching out for my people at every step. So in the beginning, making sure they can be trained, they can find their inspiration, find their way. And then when they come to a moment where they have to move out and set their own thing up or move to a postdoc or whatever, to try and accompany them and do it in a very, I would say, straightforward way. So for me, mentoring is about caring and looking out for the people who've worked for you, and also not being frightened of continuing to use one's own mentor. So I'll share a secret with you. My mentor,
yes.
when my official mentor, when I started my lab, this was before everyone had to have official mentors, but I decided to have one, was Susan Gasser, who I know has also been, on your program, on your podcast. It's very funny because at that time, so this was back in 2001, I think, and at the Curie Institute, they said to us, think of a mentor and then ask them. So I reached out to Susan and I asked her, and she said, yes, of course. But then we never really discussed. I mean, we'd meet at meetings, but I never really reached out to her. It was only later that I started to connect with her a lot more. Yeah, her advice was always super valuable. And I just felt that she, would look out for me. But then, I've had other people who've looked out for me as well.
Sorry, I was just wondering, because as young scientists, when people told us you have to go there and find mentors, sometimes we are just afraid to ask, or I don't know what was the status of Susan Gasser at this moment, but were you not afraid to contact her, or what have triggered you to contact her?
She was someone who was in my field, and I was particularly interested when I set up my lab in nuclear organization. I just spent a year with David Spector, so I'd come across Susan in the context of nuclear organization, chromosome dynamics. So she seemed a natural person for me to reach out to scientifically. And also, I'd seen her come to give talks when I was still a postdoc, and you might not believe it, but I'm actually I'm a very shy person, and I'm actually an introvert. I learned as a child to force myself to overcome those obstacles. So I've learned that if you want your life to move on, you've got to reach out to people. And sometimes they might say, look, I can't, or I'm too busy, or actually even I'm not interested. But, if you don't try, you'll never know. So I reached out to her thinking that she'd probably say no. I'm also actually deeply pessimistic about everything. That's another thing that people don't realize about me. But so I probably reached out to her at the time thinking I'm sure she'll say no because she's too busy. So, I was prepared for a no. That's how I run my life usually. I'm always prepared for a no. And then when you get a yes, it's a wonderful surprise. Yeah.
So yeah, probably this is a good trick. Actually, the be prepared for no, so you don't have the fear anymore. So what about now? If we go on the other side, what could you consider as a bad mentoring advice?
The mentoring that I got from all the people I worked with was very, very valuable. So I've been lucky. I worked with many different people who've supported me. What I would say is that there's never a perfect mentor either. So, no one always gives perfect advice. All you can do is do your best. And, I had been advised, for example, when I decided to move to the States to do a 1-year visiting scientist sort of sabbatical with David Spector's lab, I was encouraged to do that by someone else who I regard as my mentor, Christine Petit, who happened to be at the Pasteur Institute. And, she said to me, why don't you go and do a 1-year sabbatical somewhere and learn something new, and then you come back and set up your own lab. So she gave me what I thought was good advice. And then a few other people who I asked said to me, oh, don't do that. You'll waste a year of your life if you do that. Bad mentorship is to put people off from taking steps that they feel they should take. I would say, a bad mentor is someone who doesn't encourage change, sort of some kind of evolution. For me, that's the worst thing that you can do, to stunt people in their lives.
So you ignored the advice and went away on sabbatical. So
yes.
Why do you think a sabbatical, what's special about a sabbatical?
Well, I think not just a sabbatical. I think in general, in science, we're lucky enough to have a relative degree of freedom to move around the world and experience different environments. And I think changing environment is absolutely key to evolving as a scientist. So I think that, taking steps that take you out of your comfort zone really help. They're painful usually in the beginning, but that process of taking stock of a new environment, adapting to it, having new input to what you do, asking questions to new people. For me, every step of my career where I've changed environment has been incredibly fruitful because I've managed to move into new things, sometimes without even realizing. When I went to Cold Spring Harbor, for example, I thought I was going to do a certain number of experiments and I was going to be able to benefit from, the wonderful environment I had there in David Spector's lab. And he was generous enough to host me and say, basically do what you like in my lab, which was incredible. And from that, I ended up realizing not only how important it is to have a rich network of scientists who you can exchange with, but also that indeed you can try different things and they don't all work, but then you can explore them. So I ended up going down avenues I never imagined, which is, for example, to explore chromatin marks and axon activation. I didn't imagine I was going to end up doing that quite like that. So I think a sabbatical was an amazing thing because you do get exposed to different people and different scientists and a different culture and a different country in that case. But also, I think it's important to you put things into perspective that, what you take for granted sometimes in the way science is run in one place is not the way it's run in another place. And not to be judgmental as well, because if one doesn't see other perspectives, it's very difficult to sort of not be open to different ways of doing things.
We want now to hear your vision about running a lab. What are you looking for in a student, in a postdoc, and especially how do you work with them?
So my vision is, I would say it's more my instinct. The way I've always run my life, I guess, is that I need to feel that I can interact with people in a very easy and creative way, be it for good things or bad times, the good times and the bad times. So when a student or a postdoc applies to my lab, I really try to get a sense of whether we can communicate at the right level, we're on the same wavelength. I try to lay my cards on the table immediately and tell them how I see life in my lab. And I also try to make them project into what they would get out of my lab and then for their next steps. If it's a student, I talk to them about what it means to do a PhD and how tough it can be, but also how amazing this period is of PhD. But then for a postdoc, I also tell them that, they have to prepare themselves for the next steps, which could be either to become a PI or to do other things. But it is a conscious thing one has to think about. And I try to help people and accompany them in that. So, but then in the daily sort of running of a lab, for me, the ideal environment is one where people can just talk to each other freely and to me. So, now because I'm DG at EMBL, it's become much more challenging for me to do that, especially with the pandemic as well. But, for me, the ideal lab is one where me as group leader, I'm in my office with an open door and people can just walk in and out to tell me whatever that they need to tell me about. And I hope that's how my students and postdocs and other people perceive me. And also just to share the excitement and also the pain of science. So, collaboration, team spirit really matters a lot to me. Mm-hmm. Now, whether I always achieve it is another matter.
So one question that I had certainly when you were talking about pain and moment difficulty in research, do you have a special trick to create the room to let the people talk about the difficult moment or to exchange about this?
I mean, one-to-ones, when I have people in my office to tell me about their project, I realized, actually, I didn't even know I was doing it until a couple of my students actually told me. Usually, I always start the conversation with, how are you? How are you feeling? How are you doing? And I mean, for me, it's just such an obvious thing to ask. Before you start talking about people's data, you want to know a little bit about where they are not in their whole life, but, if something awful just happened to them, then what's the point of talking about the data if they're feeling crappy or whatever? So I usually try to open conversations in a way that would allow people to tell me, there have been difficult moments in my lab, as in many labs, and I do try to either organize things in a collective way so people can talk to each other. For example, during the group meeting, I can remember at least 2 or 3 occasions where we had to have a sort of emergency, powwow to sort of say, well, what do you think? What should we do? How can we handle this? But what I realized really worked is to organize retreats with my lab and with another lab. So we did this for several years, actually, with Jos Gribnau's lab and actually now with Jos Gribnau and Claire Rougel's lab. And just allowing people to share time together and talk about science and talk about life is so important. And doing it regularly is really important too. Now, unfortunately, we haven't done this for a while now because of the pandemic, but I'm looking forward to doing that. And then also just spending a bit of social time with the lab as well, where they feel that they can feel free to, joke about me and life in general. So, yeah, I'm not sure how much of a vision that is, but if you want a more kind of formal response to your question, my vision is to try and make sure that we really do together take steps to answer sometimes very challenging questions and to do it in a collaborative and synergistic way so that people feel, I always feel there's more out of a collective group of people that can come than from single individuals. And I hope that my vision is that the lab members that I produce and move on can take some of that with them, because I think there's so much power in synergy and collective thinking.
Do you think you can spot whether a student has that potential to become a creative scientist?
I don't think you can. I mean, spot it, yes, eventually, but not in the first 5 minutes. No.
So,
honestly, no, I can't. I couldn't say that. Also, I just think of myself as a student. I was plagued by doubts when I went and interviewed for my PhD position. I'm not sure that, Mike Fried, who very kindly chose me as his student, I don't know how convinced he was that I was going to be, a success. In fact, the first 3 years, as I said, he'd just come and breathe down my neck and say, "You're getting nowhere fast." So probably he was thinking to himself, "Oh my God, how did I feel I can spot people who don't actually care that much about science. And that's probably the more important thing. I try to make sure that the people who I take in my lab care about science and care about working in a group of people who are doing science. You can't just do science on your own, on your little lonesome. And so that's what I try to find out from people, that they want the scientific endeavor and they want to do it with a group of people who think in that way too.
So you said it hasn't always been easy. We wondered whether any of those difficulties have been linked to being a woman in science, and whether you have particular words of advice for young women coming into science.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yes. This is it's a classic question.
Well, you are a woman in science awardee, so.
Sure. No, I mean, there are so many levels at which one can answer this question. I guess, the short answer is yes, of course, there have been challenges to being a woman in science. I also want to say that I feel very lucky that all the people I've worked for, my PIs, my mentors, have always been very supportive and meant that I didn't have to really think about it. So at that level, no, I haven't had any, major obstacles in my career ever since I started my PhD. But I have had, moments where I think, well, if I wasn't a woman, maybe this would have been easier. Having challenging discussions at meetings where, scientists don't agree sometimes. And, I've been told that I should be a bit more quiet and not voice my thoughts, because otherwise it could sound, well, I won't use the words, but, so I've had that kind of comment, and I think, goodness, if I'd been a guy, they would never have said that to me. So those are not big challenges. I did right at the beginning of my career have one major challenge. I don't know if I've ever said this to anyone in detail, but when I applied to do my PhD, one of the people who was at Cambridge and who had to send in a letter for me clearly wasn't very supportive. And, so luckily I had a couple of other people who were super supportive, including Phil Oliver, who sadly passed away just last year. But anyway, there was someone else who wasn't that supportive. And it turns out in those days, we didn't have email and stuff like that. So he actually faxed his letter. And Mike Freed told me after he offered me the position, he said, luckily I offered you the position before I got the letter that came through the post, because the fax came through black. The machine wasn't working that day. And he said, and when I read the letter, I never would have taken you. And so there I thought, wow. And this, so I'm not going to. So I might have ended up not doing a PhD at all. And so I did feel, and this was really a case where, it was in the 80s when I was an undergraduate, there was a lot of support for students like me, but there was also a certain sort of, majority male dominating atmosphere. I think that's definitely changing, but I did come across a bit of that at the beginning. But after that, I did less so. But what I did notice was for other women around me, and then I became more and more militant. So now I've become, I'm not a militant feminist at all, but I'm a militant or proactive sort of vigilante to make sure that women do take the right steps in their lives. And of course, I'm always available when people want advice about how I juggled my home and professional lives, etc. And I also try to make sure that people realize that you have to take care. Gender balance is not a given yet. And it's a bit like other big issues. Even democracy is not a given. So you have to keep your eyes open and make sure that you speak up when you need to.
So everything went well, Pasteur, Curie, and then you decided to move country again and to take on and to be the first woman DG of EMBL. So what made you take that decision?
So the EMBL, I think, has always been somehow a temple of molecular biology in my mind, a bit like Cold Spring Harbor was in the States for me. So I'd never worked at EMBL, but I'd always heard wonderful things. And when I was at the Curie Institute, of course, the modern Curie Institute was modeled somehow on EMBL by Danielle Louvain, who would always be telling us about, this amazing organization. So I took the job not so much because I wanted to change country again. I was actually very happy where I was in Paris. I was extremely happy at the Curie Institute. I was super happy to be professor at the Collège de France. I wasn't looking for a change. And I think there were three reasons why I accepted the role. One is because I really believe in the power of fundamental research, discovery-driven research. I started to feel that there was a true need to defend it. For me, it was an opportunity to take on an organization that is dedicated to fundamental research, but also to enabling fundamental research for others, and not just fundamental, actually applied research for others, because EMBL provides service, it provides access to infrastructures, it provides training. We train people from PhDs to postdocs to engineers. And it's very collaborative. So constantly bringing in people to learn from us and to do basic research or to use our facilities. So it was somehow a dream organization at that level. And then the second reason was because I'm a fervent European, and I felt that it was important to defend European science. And then the third reason was because as a woman, I felt that maybe I had a bit of a duty to take on a role that would somehow show that women could be in leadership positions. As I said, I'm militant in just making sure that people realize that this is possible. I don't want to be a role model necessarily. I don't think, my life is it's a very special life and I'm very happy with it, but I don't think it's necessarily the model that other people need. But at least people can see that I can do it. Someone like me can do it. And it doesn't mean, sacrificing my research or sacrificing my family. And it doesn't mean that, I get sucked up into being just an administrator. So it's a very exciting job. It's also a very demanding job. And it's still quite new to me. But it was an offer that I couldn't really refuse. And I don't think I would have accepted any other offer, actually. So for me, EMBL was unique. Yeah.
So how and when precisely did you know you were ready to become a director of such an institute?
I still somehow I sometimes wonder whether I'm ready, actually. As ever, this self-doubt thing is part of my way of life. So how did I think I was able? When I talked to the people who reached out to me to find out if I would be interested, they were very convincing in telling me that I had the right characteristics or attributes that would allow me to do it. So caring a lot about science and also, caring about scientists and people around me, because I'd been, director of a unit for several years. And so I felt in a way that maybe I did have that capacity to be a director of something bigger. I didn't quite imagine just how big it was going to be. I do have to admit that it was it has been challenging because it's not an institute, it's actually 6 institutes spread over 5 different countries, and each institute is different. And as I said earlier, we don't just do research, we deliver service. We provide some of the tools that people use without even thinking. When people go in and do a quick search for, protein structure or gene or whatever, they use our services. So this is actually a very interesting organization to run. And after a year of starting where I had to discover everything, then the pandemic hit. So it became even more interesting. I would say, yes, it was much more challenging than I ever imagined. And obviously the pandemic didn't help. But it was also it's been an incredible discovery because I've learned so much more about different areas of science and also the way to make a big multidisciplinary, multicultural organization work. And there's something really magical about it, where you bring together people from all different origins. And I don't just mean, different countries, but backgrounds, and you get them to work together for this mission, which is really just to serve Europe and to serve science. And I find that is actually extraordinary. So I have 27 countries who I have to convince EMBL is worthy of. And that's what I'm doing right now. I'm in the midst of trying to work with my 27 member states to convince them that EMBL is a worthy investment for the future. And that's exciting. It's also challenging. Yeah.
Because you're talking about all those challenges and the daily work you have now. Can you tell us a bit what does a typical week looks like?
Gosh, I don't want to frighten you too much.
No one will ever want to take the job again.
What I've realized is that one does have to be extremely organized to be able to not just manage, but also lead an organization. So what actually takes time, or took a lot of time, was trying to work out how EMBL was organized and how, to make everything sort of function as efficiently as possible. And that really came home during the pandemic. So, a typical day would be several meetings thinking about operational things, dealing with a crisis management, but also dealing with things like, new buildings. We're building a new imaging center. So, I have meetings like that peppered throughout my week. I have meetings throughout my week to talk with our 27 member states. So I spend a lot of time talking to ministries and people in the ministries and also scientists in different countries. And I also spend time talking to some of the different areas I have to work with within EMBL. So I have a strategy office where we think about our new program, which is very exciting. So, there are parts of my day that are fantastically creative, where I'm thinking about our new program called Molecules to Ecosystems and how molecular biology can move into thinking about life in the context of the environment. So, whoa. And then how to do that in a kind of operational way. Who do we need to talk to? Which are the member states we need to get on board? And how. So that's part of it. And then, of course, I also have time with my lab. I try to do that regularly. We have lab meetings every week. And I also need to talk to the people who work with me on a daily basis. The people in my office. Was, for me, one of the biggest realizations is if you want something to change or evolve, you've got to talk about it, and you've got to spend time having conversations with people. And that means that the last 2.5 years have just been nonstop. So basically, I start usually at 8:30 in the morning and I end at 8:30 in the evening. And often, even at weekends, things are a little tough. Luckily, I have a very, very vigilant husband who makes sure that I take a little bit of time to try and balance my life.
So we're going to talk more about Edith's life after the break, but just to sort of finish the first half, when you were appointed to the EMBL, Patrick Kramer, who was the head of the EMBL Council, said, "Today is a great day for European science." So we wondered, what is your vision for European science? And if some of our listeners were in America, what does that mean, European science? How can you explain that?
Yes, it's a rich tapestry of science. And I didn't quite even realize how rich it was until I started. So European science, I think, is unique because Europe is such a patchwork of different cultures, communities who have, worked together, fought against each other over many centuries, and as we know. And when it comes to science, there are different institutes within a country, but also in different countries, there are areas where some countries really are at the absolute cutting edge in the world. And what I've realized is that it's a mixture of, very, very well-trained people in different ways, in different countries, and also with different histories of the kind of science that works in. So, for example, in France, it's very interesting because there's a lot of biology that's linked to physics and maths. Maths and physics are very strong as well, and then they feed now into the biology, the scientists that you meet in France. In the UK, you can see that there's always been a very strong tradition of well-organized research. And so you could see the pandemic, it was incredible how things were just done properly, the sequencing, the Sanger Institute, and, the different universities and institutes, including EMBL, EBI. And so everything kind of fits together. And so very different aspects of science. And when they're brought together, that is, I think, truly powerful. And so for me, European science is the incredible diversity that that we have of scientists, of ways of doing science, of infrastructures, and of course of cultures. And there's a kind of philosophy of the way we should do things. And maybe this is the most important thing I need to say in answer to this question, is that a philosophy of sharing and of being open science, sharing data. Of course, it's not always open and people don't always sharing, but there's much more of that attitude I find in Europe than in other parts of the world. And for me, that is the vision I would like, Europe to lead with, and to do it by bridging, between disciplines. The more you share and the more open you are, the faster science can go. So I hope that is what European science will be about. And I hope, anyway, science should be without frontiers. For me, that's absolutely key. But especially in Europe, it should be without frontiers. And we should make the most of all the riches that we have.
So that's fantastic. Thanks for that great message to finish up. We're going to take a very short break. And after the break, we're going to talk more about Edith's life.
Hey folks, don't run away. You're listening to The Lonely Pipette with Renaud Pourpre and Jonathan Weissman, where our goal is to help scientists do better science.
If you're enjoying the show and you want to learn more, you can follow us on Twitter at Lonely Pipette, and please share the podcast with your friends.
If you don't want to miss any of our future episodes, you can subscribe to our mailing list and join our community. Click on the subscription link on our Twitter account.
It's as simple as that. Take a few moments to get more tips from the Lonely Pipette.
So welcome back. So in the second half, we're going to hear a little bit more about Edith, a little bit less of the vision for European science, a bit more about the European scientist. In the entrepreneur field, it's very popular for people to talk about their morning routines. So you said you start at 8:30, but do you have some special routine that, like, how does your day start?
My day starts usually with a mad scramble to get myself out of bed. I'm not an early morning person, but I do force myself to wake up early, and it's always excruciating. There it is. I don't think I've ever said this before, but I hate getting up.
So what's been really interesting is that we get such different answers. So we spoke to George Church at 9 o'clock in the morning, and I said, "Oh, sorry, we got you up early," and he said, "No, I've been up for 5 hours." and then Maria Elena told us, that she's in a bad mood at breakfast, and so everyone's different. So
yeah, I mean, I really am I can be a slug very easily. But usually I don't have a chance to. So indeed, I force myself. So my only routine is I have to have a coffee, an espresso. That's as much as I get. Sometimes it's completely on the trot. So I don't have any special, meditation, relaxation or whatever routine or even doing exercises. Of course I should have, but I don't. I jump straight into work. I do realize though, in the evening, I have to try and find some time to make myself switch off.
How does that work? What does that look like?
I use different tricks. Of course, if I'm with someone like my husband, just talking is a good trick about anything, everything. Listening to some music, sometimes watching a movie, but usually I don't have time to do that. And then I realize that that's very bad. So this is all, I don't want people to follow my way of life necessarily, but I tend to end up getting my evenings a little bit invaded by work, and then of course that means I don't sleep well, and so I try to break my vicious circle as much as I can, and then I try to really take time out when I'm on holiday, and I do have a capacity to switch off that people sometimes doubt, but I'm very good at switching into another part of my mind, and I've realized that is absolutely key to my creativity.
Yeah.
If I don't have a stepping away from my routine, and I don't just mean, the routine of meetings and stuff. I mean, even the routine of the science that we're doing, the questions we're asking and the experiments we're doing, I need to kind of break away from that. And my mind needs to relax into something else and own. I mean, this is, everyone knows this. You need your mind to sort of be able to take a step away for you to then come
But is
back
that on a weekly
solution.
basis or monthly, or it's?
I know it can't just be once a year. That I would never manage. So no, sometimes I'm very lucky because I have my Greek origin, so we have a house in Greece, and so even a few days in Greece, even 2 or 3 days can be enough. Obviously, I think recharging one's batteries is really important in life at every stage of your life, and I think this is an important message for all scientists out there, is that taking that time of recharging is absolutely essential to creativity in the scientific endeavor and thinking about problems in a different way, something you can't crack, or you need to come at a problem with a different angle, and taking the time to read and think without the stresses and pressures of just the daily routine. I look back to the beginning of my career when I was a PhD student, where, in those days you would do a maxi prep and you'd have to wait for like 3 or 4 days, right? Well, and it was wonderful because you were kind of waiting for your prep and you do a few other things, but you had time to just sit and read and contemplate. I'm not sure we still do that because we have so much so accessible all the time that I don't know if I was a student today, whether I would be able to capture those moments of creativity I had in my daily life. Now I feel we need to carve them out much more.
So what is something about yourself that people might be surprised to discover?
Well, I mentioned it earlier, but I am actually a very shy person.
Do you still get nervous when you give a big talk? And how do you deal with that? Because that doesn't sound like an introvert activity.
I always get nervous. In fact, when I was a student, when I started to have to give talks, and this is for several years, my supervisor, Mike Fried, told me that I had to prepare properly, and he trained me, so it would be weeks in advance, and I would write out my talk on cards, and I would try to memorize every card, and I would do it again and again and again, and I realized that I always gave pretty lousy talks because I was literally not reading out, but memorizing out what I'd learned. And then I decided to get more busy as a PI when I started my group. Literally, I just didn't have time to do that anymore. So then I would still prepare. I'd still get super nervous, but it would come out more naturally. And then I realized that, in fact, my audience was engaging with me more, which gave me the confidence that actually I was doing it right. So I still do get super nervous before a talk, any talk, including even just talking to my lab at a lab meeting if I have to give a special. I get nervous about these things.
You hide it well.
I do. I've had 56 years of training. Yeah.
What do you think in the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior or habit or something else has most improved your life?
I think probably what the last 5 years have taught me, because of my role in this sort of senior leadership position, but also interacting with many, many different cultures and countries, is to really try and put yourself into other people's positions. I always did this to some extent, but I've become very, very diligent in making sure I try to put myself in someone else's position when I'm asking them for something, or when I'm having to challenge them with something, or when I'm having to inspire them with something. I try to imagine what it must be like. And, when you're dealing with, as I said, a multi-site organization, or with 27 different countries, it was tough in the beginning, but actually it's quite enjoyable now, because you start to learn about what different places are about. And that's really, I'm not saying I do it well, but I always try, at least. And I find it actually quite satisfying, because it makes you think about where are these people coming from, and how are they going to perceive what I'm actually telling them or asking them about, and where do they think I'm coming from? So maybe that's something I'm much more conscious of than I ever used to be.
Can you think of a skill you learned outside of science, but that is surprisingly useful in your daily work?
Probably my multilingual background is incredibly useful in the way I deal with my life, both my science and the rest of my life.
So how many language do you talk?
It's not so much how many languages, it's about how I learned them. At the beginning of my life, I could only speak Greek. So I was thrown in at the deep end when I went to school, and I had to understand what was going on in an English environment where everyone spoke English and I couldn't speak a word. So I won't go into the background of why this happened. In those days, it was the way, parents were advised to deal with multilingual children. And that has marked me evermore. But it means that I've learned skills about listening to people, thinking about, how I can make myself understood, trying to interact with them, all of the time being an incredibly shy and introverted child. I was really, it was painful, but I had to learn about how to deal with different languages. And I realized that in science, that's been super useful for me, because when we, embark on a new project, I do try to think of, the knowledge we have out there and try to sort of interpret it in different ways. And I never knew I was doing this, but now I realize that when I read a paper, I always try to read it from different angles or different lights. And that's been incredibly helpful. And when we have a new project in the lab, I actually try to think about which directions it could go in and how they could be interpreted depending on the data we get, And I think this is actually about me using different bits of my brain, because I had no choice. As I said, I was thrown in at the deep end. So, for example, to come back to languages, I'm not particularly good at languages. I just had no choice. It was survival. And the same happened in France. When I moved to France, I couldn't speak French. I had very bad marks in my French O level. I got through, but it was not great. So when I came to France, I was in Phil Avner's lab and at the Pasteur Institute, and he said to me, "You have to give your lab meetings in French." Literally 3 weeks into my postdoc, I had to give a lab meeting in French. I remember using a lot of body language, waving my arms around, and just thinking this is not going to work. But within a year, I was fluent. And again, because I guess I was used to being thrown in at the deep end, and then finding my way, finding not just the right words and language, but also how to interact with people to make myself understood and to get what I wanted. Yeah.
So you mentioned that your husband Vincent is also a very successful scientist. Is that a particular challenge, juggling two scientific careers at the same time?
It's been both an incredible opportunity and gift, because we've really shared our paths ever since. I mean, we met when I was just at university. So, I was just 21 when we met. And so I would say that I've grown as a scientist very much thanks to him. In fact, many of the ideas that I explored, and hopefully he explored too, were because of this joined path that we have. But we never calculated about, both working in epigenetics. But he has always been an absolute inspiration to me. And he still is, actually. Many times it's because of the conversations I have with him that I can then, for example, come to EMBL and talk about molecules to ecosystems. He actually knows or knew before me, a lot more about ecosystems than I did. He's also been, my greatest supporter. He's more of a women in science person even than I am. He's the one who allowed me to, carry on with a very successful career and have children, and without even having to think about whether this was the way to do it or not. And so it's been incredibly successful, I would say, but also incredibly challenging. And I think, you'd have to ask him for his version
maybe
of the
we'll
story.
get him on as well.
It is tough because, having two scientists with the ups and downs of science, and usually there are more downs than ups. So, when both partners know what the pain is about, it can be a good thing, but it can also be really... you feel for the other person so much more when you know what they're talking about, right? Exactly. But then on the other hand, I think it's helped us both. But I do think that for him, at least, my career trajectory, he's had to accommodate me. So I think he's made more sacrifices than I have. And so I have to sincerely thank him for being my greatest support.
Thank you, Vincent. So what have been the greatest challenges of directing this big institute? And as you say, it's not one institute, it's 6 institutes. What has been the biggest challenge for you?
So right now, my big challenge is trying to convince 27 countries that they should invest in EMBL's future. It's something that I feel I take very passionately, because I believe in the good of science. And the pandemic really showed us this. You need science to fight this pandemic. If we hadn't had the science that had been invested in all those years ago, we wouldn't have the vaccines. We wouldn't have the therapies, and we wouldn't understand the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2. But we have to carry this on, and we have to do more. We can do more, but for this, we need investment. And EMBL, I discovered, was underfunded just because of the way they were put together over the last 10 years. There's been, I would say, chronic underfunding at the level of the member states that was compensated for very successfully by external funding, grants, etc., that people were very good at getting. But the pandemic really showed that we can't carry on like this. You can't have an organization that has to deliver missions like infrastructure access and training. You can't run that on external grants. You need to have the core funding. And so that for now is my biggest challenge, and will be for the next 6 months, convincing 27 countries that they need to invest in EMBL's future, not just to survive, but to lead and to thrive and to help them make the most of it.
So you have this fantastic, ambitious vision for European science. And at the same time, you tell us you're full of doubt and you're an introvert. So how it seems incongruous. And we hear people talk about imposter syndrome. Do you ever feel, what am I doing here? How did I get here? I shouldn't be here.
No. Of course.
How do you deal with that?
I've had imposter syndrome often. I have to say, I'm getting over it. I know I still have doubts, but I don't have imposter syndrome. I think it's actually a good thing to have doubts, and I think everyone should have a healthy dose of doubt in their day, self-doubt, not doubt in others necessarily. I think what has allowed me to overcome my introversion, my self-doubt, is that I'm deeply enthusiastic about the things I care about. So although I am a pessimist, I'm actually also an optimist. I'm not sure how I can explain that, but I can be quite idealistic about things. I really care about the bigger good, and without being, I hope, unrealistic, I am quite idealistic. And I've learned over time that if you really believe in something enough, you can actually help make it happen. Doing it for science is worthy. It's worth the time, it's worth the effort. And maybe I'm not going to succeed on all the fronts I would like to, and my self-doubt will be vindicated. But at least I'll have tried. And even if I achieve only a fraction of what I'm doing, and this goes from running a lab to running EMBL, if even only a fraction of the experiments we do, or the scientists who move from my lab are successful, I will have done my job. So yes, that's how you combine introversion, shyness, pessimism, optimism, and idealism.
That's great. Thank you for this answer. It's really great. So with all of that, how do you keep focus and not get overwhelmed by everything? Do you have any specific tip?
I have discovered that to not become overwhelmed means that you do need to try and be as organized as you can be, but that's kind of a no-brainer. I don't feel like I'm a terribly organized person. I guess in my mind, I end up organizing things. So I dedicate the focused time that's required when it really matters. To be able to do that does require discipline. And I think I'm someone who, because of my education, the way I was brought up at school, I was taught that discipline, the discipline of working, focusing, monotasking, despite the fact that what you should be doing is multitasking. And so I'm lucky to have that. But probably the key to it, not being overwhelmed, because of course I do feel overwhelmed many times, is to be able to talk to people. And that goes back to what a mentor's for. Being able to share some of the good things and the bad things, the troubles, the challenges, talking ideas through, I find is extremely useful. So I guess that's my answer, is talking to people does help me keep things balanced and not feel overwhelmed.
Could you identify an apparent failure which set you up for a later success?
Well, I would say, most of my early career was a series of failures. My PhD was in a struggle and only sort of took off at the last minute. The basis of many of our discoveries were built on the failures of my first few years as a postdoc to try to define what was the minimal region of the X chromosome that could trigger exon activation. So these transgenesis experiments were pretty much failures because we showed that single copy transgenes just would not work to trigger exon activation, at least in embryonic stem cells and random exon activation. So it was that failure that drove me then to think about nuclear organization, to think about chromatin, to think about regulatory landscapes. So that's a scientific failure that I think was very much at the heart of the rest of my career and my lab's careers, actually. And then I guess from the perspective of being a scientist, there have been moments where you feel that you failed, people in your lab or people who you collaborate with, where you haven't been able to deliver together. There have been several of these occasions where I feel like we could have done more, or maybe I didn't make the right decision about a project together with a person. I'm someone who I don't forget things easily, and I try to make sense of some of that. And I always try to make sure I talk through my failures as well as the successes with the people in my lab. So what I've learned is to always try and make the best out of something. So even when a project doesn't pan out the way we want to, think about, well, can we publish at least a methods paper or something like that? So I've always tried to find something to salvage.
So wrapping up, if you were to meet yourself 20 years younger or as a postdoc, what advice would you give yourself?
To be less anxious about doing science. I think I've always been quite an anxious person, and maybe that's part of also being a scientist. I don't know. You need to be constantly asking questions and worrying about answers, not sleeping at night because you think, oh my God, did I do the right control? And what if this undermines the whole study? Just to be a little less anxious and to enjoy the whole process more. I think I didn't really start enjoying myself fully until, quite just a few years ago. My lab helped me enjoy it. And I should say, and we haven't talked about them, but maybe I should give them a word. My children, I had my children when I was relatively young, my daughter when I was 26, my son when I was 30. I feel that, if I'd been a bit less anxious about my science, maybe, I would have been less anxious with them as well. So I think if I went back, I would just tell myself, keep cool, enjoy. Life is too short. Make the most of every single minute you have. And my kids have taught me a little bit of that as well. My husband too.
So we are going to wrap up now. And so to finish, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Well, I'm on the EMBL website, so you can find out about me there. I'm also on the Collège de France website. And if you really want to hear about what someone like me thinks about, every year I have to give my annual lectures at the Collège de France. So that's one environment, but it's all in French. Other than that, I think on my website, I don't have a blog. I don't tweet, very rarely. But I do tend to always respond to people if they ask me a question. So people could just contact me as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It's been great. Thank you for giving us so much of your time and so much of your thoughts. And thank you on behalf of all European scientists. Thank you for all that sacrifice and investment on our behalf.
Well, thank you.
We're very grateful for that.
And, it's a sacrifice, but on the other hand, I wouldn't do it if I didn't feel it was something I wanted to do. And thank you for setting up Lonely Pipette, which I think is a fantastic endeavor. And I hope my podcast will live up to the others.
Sure, Edith. Thank you, Edith. It was a pleasure to have you here and to have so much time with you. Is there anything else you want to add?
I would just tell all scientists out there or people who are interested in science that really it's so much worthwhile, and there's so much that we have to discover, and to enjoy biology. And biology is not just about understanding how we can fix things and heal things, be it human health or it's about discovery and that wonderful, idea that you can wake up in the morning and go and discover. That's the inspiration to be a scientist. And I hope that many, many young people will realize that. So probably that's my parting words.
So that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining us at the Lonely Pipette.
We hope that you learnt something new, that something resonated with your own experiences, or that you just enjoyed the science.
Let us know your thoughts on Twitter at Lonely Pipette, and please share it with your friends in the lab. If you want to join our community, you can subscribe to the Lonely Pipette mailing list or mail us by following the link available on our Twitter profile. You will receive the next episodes directly in your mailbox. How cool is that?
Stay tuned for the next show, and remember, You might feel like a lonely pipette, but it doesn't mean you're alone. Tips from the Lonely Pipette can help you to do better science.
À bientôt!
A bientôt!